was actually just on the radio this morning on WDET talking about libraries.
When you were like, oh, I was on WDET, I was like, well, yes, you have your show. You are frequently on WDET. Was this like a special visit?
Yeah, they have a morning news talk show, and I was an entire segment where they occasionally like to have segments where they want to remind listeners about the wonders and glories that are libraries.
Well, good for them, because I often want to remind listeners about the wonders and glories that are public radio.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which receives precious little funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and mostly relies on donations from listeners like you.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
And they were just having an epiphany live on air about how, independent journalists and librarians, though you might not know, feel like they have a little bit in common.
It's more than a little bit, actually. I was just explaining this. I went to see a play at Stagecrafters down the street in Royal Oak over the weekend. One of the folks I was seeing it with, I'd met for the first time as a public school teacher. And she found out I was a librarian. She was like, oh, cool. I was like, yeah, the allied professions. Like, that is what they literally called them when I was in graduate school. Journalists, librarians, and teachers. That's the academic term, is the allied professions.
Wonderful. That's so exciting. I love that. You're, of course, listening to A Little Too Quiet. It's the Ferndale Library podcast, brought to you by the Friends of the Ferndale Library. And our guest has just joined us, but she hasn't put on headphones yet. That's okay. She doesn't have to. Hey, Drew.
Hi.
So, everyone, this is our ongoing series of cool library people, and this is the first time. Oh, by the way, of course.
I was going to say, who are you?
By the way, of course, I'm Jeff. As always, joined by Mary Graham.
Hi.
And this is the first time that we're not actually Zooming with our guest, because our guest isn't far away in another city. It's Drew Macaulay. It's the director of the Ferndale Library. Drew!
Yay!
Welcome to the podcast.
You will remember Drew from such excellent episodes as Outreach and Nonfiction and
several film podcasts too, yeah.
Very cool things.
Yeah.
So we know Drew. You know Drew.
Yeah. Drew, you got some tea or coffee there? What's going on?
No, it is water. We are switching over so I don't vibrate while I'm talking.
I should have done that, but I didn't. This is my second cup of coffee today, so you're all in for a fun time.
Living on the edge.
Hydration is essential. That's our PSA for today.
Along with support your local public broadcasting radio station.
Yes. And Drew, basically, we were just chatting about how as soon as anyone kind of hears more about what libraries and librarians do, they have gosh, wow moments. They really do. They really have epiphanies. And maybe that's a good spot to start. Like, how and when did you find yourself entering library world?
Because you have had a wide-reaching and very interesting career.
Yes, indeed.
Right. So there's like a 20-year gap where I'm not in libraries.
Okay.
But if you go way, way back to the mid-90s.
Yeah.
One of my first jobs was in the technical services department at Willard Library, which is the public library in Battle Creek. So I started out preparing books for circulation, but I also got to help the public use an industrial laminator, which was like, it could be up to 6 feet wide, what you could laminate. It was very, very cool. It took a solid 25 minutes to warm up.
This is something the public might not know, is that every single library worker I've ever met is obsessed with laminators, myself very much included. The first time I ever powered up the laminator here, and we now have quite a large one, but at the time I was just learning how to use our little, the one you can use for like 8.5 by 11 paper. The sheer power that I felt upon putting the thing into the laminator, I was like, wow, people should fear me. So I can see why, despite the 20-year gap, that would get you, and you would be like, I must return.
Yeah.
There's elemental aspects to the laminator because you have heat and pressure. But the result of the heat and pressure is preservation. It's the exact opposite of destruction. It's so cool.
Yeah.
So I worked there in high school, and then when I left for college, one of the very first things I did, my second day on campus, was attempt to sell myself to the libraries that were available to me. So I attempted to get a job at Stockwell Mudd, which was the academic library. They rejected me as a freshman. So I went to the public library, Albion Public, and made friends with then director Karen Sherrard, who was really an amazing person. And I got to be the library aide who opened and closed the buildings on weekends. So I would open it by myself. So as an 18-year-old, I got to be alone in the library by myself.
Again, unchecked power.
First thing in the morning on a Saturday. And I was a very, very nerdy college student who did not go to parties or do anything exciting on Friday night. So to me, this was like the highlight of my week. Yeah, so I worked there all 4 years, and then over winter break of my freshman year, all of the library staff went on break from the academic libraries, and I got brought in as a temp, and I stayed. And I got to work in circ there for the remainder of my time. I worked all of my breaks there, so I would be largely alone in the academic library. There's a theme here about introversion.
Sure.
Yeah, and I worked in the media center, which at that time was a metal cage full of VHS tapes.
I'm loving all of this.
But I would work shifts that nobody wanted. So I would work the 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. Saturday shift, the opening Sunday shift, and I would just watch foreign films largely in this cage. And we also had a really large repository of microfilm and microfiche historical Michigan-based documents. So I got a lot of interesting historians popping through that I got to help with that. So I did that, and then I didn't become a librarian for 20 years.
What happened?
Yeah, I know. What happened?
So weird, isn't it? It's so weird. And Karen Sherrard, director of the Albion Public Library, suggested maybe you should go to library school. And I said, no, libraries are not going to be very important in the rising digital information age.
Gasp.
I had such a misunderstanding of what was happening in the information environment.
Yep, forgivable though. That was kind of the vibe.
It was the 90s.
Late 90s,
Things were
early
different.
2000s. Yeah.
So I did not go to library school, even though
my
that was
goodness.
clearly the trajectory I was supposed to be on.
Oh my gosh. What does happen next? You don't have to dive into it.
Yeah, so I graduate with an English and theater degrees,
Wahoo.
which shockingly don't pay very well. One of the other things I learned at Albion College, in addition to stage tech, textual analysis, and the joys of VHS, was how to milk goats. Because the head of the English department at the time had a small hobby farm with milk goats. And I would take care of those goats while I was on break working at the academic library by myself. So it turns out that if you get into an internet chat with other people who raise hobby goats, that they're always looking for people to come live on their farms and milk goats, and that was very lucrative compared to my other options.
Oh, all right.
So I went from Albion, being an English major, to moving to rural Virginia and milking goats for a while.
As one does.
And there's shockingly, where there's a high concentration of milk goats, there's not a lot of other culture. Not much foreign film, not many interesting restaurants, no concerts to speak of. So I decided that I needed to get back to an urban setting, so I went and became a licensed vet tech. I went to community college and got my cert both as a general vet tech and as a rad tech assistant to vets. And then that allowed me to move to the suburbs of DC, where there's lots of culture. And I did that for several years, but I missed Detroit and I missed Michigan. And I noticed that there was a civil service opening to work at the zoo. So I took a bus home, I took the civil service exam, I went back to DC, and 18 months later,
Wow.
they finally called me and said, "Do you still want to be a zookeeper?"
Hey.
And I was like, yeah, I guess I do.
Yes.
So that brought me home, and I worked as a zookeeper in the Great Apes division for a while. And eventually I needed to transition from physical labor to a more white collar position. So I went to law school because that's the normal process. You work with chimps and you work with lawyers. There's a lot of overlap. So I went to
You can make that
law
joke because you're the
school.
one who went to law school.
I can't. So I went to law school at UD Mercy and had some really great experiences in the city. I worked at Blue Cross Blue Shield and BCN, which is the HMO part. I worked for a while in personal injury, but eventually where I ended up was in a very, very niche corporate field of healthcare federal funding compliance, which is making sure that Medicare and Medicaid plans are correctly obeying what the federal government says you have to do in order to receive federal funds. And so this very, very dry, very limited field.
Oh, but somebody's got to do it.
But also compassionate. Yeah, there's an underlying.
Right.
You
And
want to help people.
trying to get
What they need.
corporations to follow the law.
Yes.
And so
And treat
that
humans
was
like humans.
That was kind of interesting in that I worked with healthcare plans in 47 states, and I had to schedule mediations and discussions across every single time zone.
Whoa.
We had a plan in Puerto Rico. It was a lot. And I survived 3 levels of corporate buyouts and mergers, including a stint in private equity before my company got bought out by a gigantic corporation. And I felt very divorced from the aspects of law that are intriguing, which is research, writing, and negotiating, and very caught up in the aspects of law that, for me, were kind of mind-numbing. So I burned out pretty spectacularly around the same time that we had to shut everything down for COVID. So it was really great timing on
You
my
were
part.
having a great, just
Wow.
super fun.
And then when I was sitting silently in my house, locked down, thinking, well, if you could do anything, what would you like to do? And when was the last time you were very happy? And the last time I was very happy was working in libraries.
I was about to say,
So-
did visions of the VHS cage swim before your eyes?
Yeah. What a formidable plot twist. I love it.
True. I know that this miniseries is literally called Cool Library People, but that entire story, I'm just sitting here going, that's so cool to
Yes.
all of it.
Yes. Even though you said you were uncool the entire time, it was cool.
I mean, obviously, the universe has worked out as it should
Yeah.
because we think you should be in libraries for the rest of ever because it's great to have you as a coworker.
For sure.
But
You know,
that's fabulous.
one of our favorite questions, and I'm going to jump ahead. One of our favorite questions is like the library epiphany question. And I feel like you got that early because it sounds like that was such a wonderful time for you 20 years past. Do you remember where you really realized, well, no, actually, now I'm remembering 7 minutes ago when you said libraries weren't going to be a thing. Oh my gosh. Was your library epiphany coming back? Like, oh my gosh, wait, they're still around.
Yeah, well, there's an ongoing epiphany, which is that when you are stuck in a beautiful, beautiful part of the Blue Ridge Mountains, surrounded by wildflowers and just amazing mountains, and I rode horses. It was very bucolic. That is actually kind of dead and empty in the absence of access to meaningful engagement with media and access to trustworthy sources of information, because this predates widespread Wi-Fi and a lot of digital resources. So it was just hugely a relief for me to move back to DC and start going to libraries. And then, there's a trite saying that libraries will get you through times of no money better than money will get you through times of no libraries. But that was very, very true for me when I was really struggling to feed and house myself, working in agriculture and animal care. I made huge use of the libraries. So I had this continuous ongoing relationship through the alleged death of the public library.
Rumors were greatly exaggerated.
Exactly.
I'd never heard that saying before, but I love it. Of what is it?
I think it's actually books will get you through times of no money better than money will get you through times of no books.
But I think swapping that out for libraries is even more true. That's great.
What about, we also like to ask about library misconceptions that are prevailing, and what is one that bugs you, or what was one that you even held yourself? I
So
guess?
there's several that annoy me. The one that hits us every day here at Ferndale is that the library should be quiet.
Right.
No.
And the library should provide areas for focused concentration.
Sure.
And we definitely do that. But the library is not inherently quiet. And it fills me with so much joy to see people engaging with each other, with information, with their projects. And that sometimes makes a little noise. So librarians don't shush and libraries aren't quiet. So that's like the concrete one. But there's also one that like annoys me in the public discourse, which is that libraries are a building. They are a location that you look up and go to. And that's so not true, because a library is a multimorphous resource. It's not amorphous. It does have a location. There is a building, but it is multimorphous in that it has many, many forms that are present in the community. So the library is present in outreach. It is present in the schools. It is present in programming. It is present in the community relationships we have with businesses. Those are all manifestations of the movement of information and resources. The movement itself is the library.
Can we put a multimorphous resource on the side of the building? Ferndale Area District Library, :
That's incredible.
a multimorphous resource. That is so true. And I think maybe I had never, God, Jeff, I'm having a library epiphany on air. Like, I think that's my favorite thing about the job.
Yeah.
Is that, you know, the number, I don't live in Ferndale. I've never lived in Ferndale. In my life outside of work, generally do not go very far north of 8 Mile. I'm a Detroit creature, not born, but bred. And I love it here so much. I love working here. I love occasionally, you know, running to the grocery store here and running into people who, or running into them at the coffee shop and being like, hey, like, I know you, not just because they come here, but because I go to their schools, or because we see them at outreach events that we do, or any, you know, it's so easy to say, I got a guy, gender neutral, at the library. And that is a really wonderful thing for me about working in this location in particular, is that, gosh, do the people of Ferndale love that multimorphousness.
Oh, yes.
They're like, the library's here, marvelous. And they're not talking about the building. They're talking about the library people are here.
Yeah, there's something fortuitous about being out to get your coffee and be like, whoa, library presence.
Yes. Yeah. And I only ever see that great big grin. Whoa, the library's here. I never see people, don't get any ideas, anyone. I never see people going, ugh, the library. It's always like, okay, that's maybe not what I need today, so I'm just not really going to notice it. Or it's going to be like, oh, thank God you're here. I have a question, or how do I renew my card, or what are you up to today? Like, it's just grand.
From my loose field work that I've done, even if people are
Loose
out there,
field work,
even if
local famous Ferndale cryptid Jeff Milo.
even if people aren't currently library card holders, or it's been a while, or they haven't been in a while, generally everyone loves the library. They love the idea of the library.
Yeah, and
They're like, oh, library. And it might be, maybe it's just good memories from childhood, or they just know.
You know, I find that even, I mean, thinking about the library isn't quiet thing, I would invite people to cast in their memory and see if they can remember going to a library that feels, not to quote our own name, a little too quiet. A library that will remain nameless that I go to on a semi-regular basis for reasons is like that. And it's not the silence of, you know, when I was, this is very common in university libraries, there will be a system on the floors about how quiet you're expected to be.
Sure.
So the ground floor is basically, that's indoor voices, but that's cafe level.
Sure.
You know, that's people are holding study group meetings, people are asking librarians questions in normal voices. And then as you get higher, but usually the top floor of a university library is the silent floor. Like if you need to talk, go downstairs for that very quiet concentration. But I find if I'm in a public library and the whole place feels like the top floor of a university library, freaks me out.
Yep.
Feels very maybe dead's not the right word, but foreboding. And foreboding is not a word I would ever associate with this library. And I think that's one of the reasons people like us is even if, they haven't been to the library in ages, or they don't have an active card, or especially in the days before, we're fine free now. But and we always have been since I've worked here. But when I was in library school, I worked at a library with fines, and people would be like, oh my God, you work at the library. Like, I feel so bad. I've got these overdue books. And we would always be like, hey, don't worry about it. Like, you're going to bring them back at some point. Like, we are used to this. We see this every day. That kind of welcoming, we're just happy to have you here. Sometimes kids will come back into the kids' corner, and either they or their grown-up will be like, we just stopped at the front desk and got a library card, or they say, oh, it's our first time in. And I always make sure to say, hey, welcome to the library.
Sure.
And, I think especially with just the way everything is right now, people just want to feel welcome and like someone is happy to see them.
For sure.
And I'm always happy to see patrons who we're doing the patron social contract kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I like a busy day full of interesting questions. I'm always happy to see people in here. So we're recording this during Ferndale School's break week.
Yeah.
And so we're going to have an above average level of school children in here, especially as the week goes on and everybody is tired of staying indoors. I think that's great.
Yeah. The thing about a library that's staying too quiet for too long during the day, it's akin to an empty dance floor.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of wallflowers.
Yeah.
And no one thinks they can dance.
Oh, that's a much
And then it
better.
perpetuates. And then
That's a much,
you got to be that person who just is the first to start dancing.
Exactly.
That's a better metaphor than what I thought. I thought a completely silent place is a crypt.
Yeah, well, I mean that too.
Mausoleum is the word that came to mind for me.
The next question is a fun one because
well,
it almost sounds redundant.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So normally at this point we would ask us,
and we're still gonna
would ask about the current library you work at and other previous libraries.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, you've told us a bit about the libraries you worked at in college.
Tell us about coming to Ferndale. Yeah.
Was this where you worked in library school?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. So I started here in August of 2021.
We have the same hire date, actually.
Yeah, we do. We had the same first day.
Yep, it was you and me.
Oh my gosh,
Epiphany.
that was so great.
It was awesome.
Yay, and it was nice to not have to start all by myself.
Yes,
Yeah.
I had the same thought.
Yeah, so I started library school in May of 2021. So I had less than one semester of library school, and I started at CERC. Which means this was in the time period when technical services was part of CERC, which means I went right back to the job I had at 15.
Wow.
Yep. With, in middle age with my law degree. I was like, and now I am back to processing books. And gosh, was I happy to be back processing books.
I also remember you, I think, spearheaded the new library card survey, and you would give reports every so often at the monthly staff meeting. And you were clearly so delighted to be crunching those numbers of, we ask people questions when they come get a new library card. Things like, how'd you hear about us? What's your main reason? Stuff like that. The number of people who say, I just moved here and I want to get to know the neighborhood. That's my favorite reason people give. They're like, you guys do stuff. I'm going to come to the stuff.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, Drew, now you're the director of the library. You might be out there getting coffee, or you might be at a library conference one day and someone might say to you, so what's the library like? Do you have a general answer you're cooking up for Ferndale?
Yeah. So I always like the phrase small but mighty.
Yeah.
We contain depth. So we are a single branch library, and yet our collections belie so much, and our programming is outsized to our staff and our categorical measurements. So, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
On the subject of first days, at the time of this recording, not to change the subject and make it about me, but in 3 weeks, it's my 15th anniversary.
Of working here.
Isn't that wild?
Wow.
I know.
That's amazing. Is that all in
It's
one
kind of
go?
amazing.
Or is that, because you started and then you went to college, right?
Oh gosh, if we're counting that, then it's closer to 18 years. I was a page here in high school. But Drew, so I think feel free to answer both questions if one is easier to reach for first. We like to ask what you're finding most fulfilling about your role here, but you've had several roles here. You've also been head of adult services.
You've also been you've been adult services, but not the head of it.
Yeah, circulation, adult service librarian, head of it.
You've done basically every job here except page and youth librarian.
Yeah.
Which personally I think is a great experience for a director to have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what is that answer? What is that role?
So there's kind of two sort of related, like what's the most fulfilling, what is most satisfying. So like one aspect of what's most fulfilling is, like, to borrow a phrase from Buddhism, to be the finger pointing at the moon. So when you work at CERC or you work at the reference desk, people come in and they have their own goals, their own projects, their own problems, and you don't solve them. You just help them figure out what's already available to help them be autonomous, to be independent, to fix it themselves. And you gesture to the resources and you make sure that they know that these resources really do exist. So I find that incredibly satisfying to know that I don't have to make somebody's life better. I don't have to help somebody get a job. I don't have to help somebody solve their housing challenge. I can help them know that in the world they're already in, they already have what they need to do it. Wow. So I really love that aspect specifically of librarianship. And when I worked in CERC, and you're the first face people see, helping people who are new to the library realize, oh yes, there's books, and there are all of these databases, there are all of these digital resources, there are all these things that you can leave the building without carrying anything, and you have already left with more resources than you came in with. So I really love that. But the other really fulfilling aspect of my job, which continues more specifically also as a director, I get to see this, is being in a public library setting means that you get to see people who otherwise would have no reason to engage with each other, meet and interact in interesting ways. So my first programming responsibilities were running a tabletop role-playing game series over the summer. So once a month for 5 hours, we would play a themed set of tabletop games. And
that was so cool. I didn't even attend, but like I remember, because working, but I remember reading the like one-off premises.
It was so fun.
And I was like, that is fantastic. I'm so happy that exists.
It was so cool because you would get, I had people who were barely 18. We had somebody come in on their 18th birthday, excited to be in adult programming. And I had a person who came to all of them who had just retired at 62. I had people who had never done any role playing. I had people who had only done Dungeons and Dragons. I had people who were inveterate gamers and were just excited to meet new people. Phone numbers got exchanged. New campaigns got started. Like, you watch these people who otherwise would not have had a reason to interact discover aspects of each other's creativity and so on and so forth. And you see that in other settings also. So I facilitate film clubs sometimes. There are the hardcore film club people who will come to any movie. It can be 1935, it can be Last Week, it can be black and white, it can be animated. They're there. They just want to talk about film. They're excited. But then you get the people who only come to specific genres, subgenres, or submediums. So I'm coming to Marcel the Shell, but I will never come to anything else. And these people have strong opinions. And then they're confronted with people who have never been exposed to their genre. And that creates these really amazing interactions that I feel really lucky to get to watch. You know, if somebody knows a lot about French New Wave and somebody doesn't, know who Varda is, but they both watched the same film recently, they're going to have a different type of interaction than either of them would have had outside of the opportunity to be in the public community, sharing an experience and exchanging perceptions. So it's the opportunity to be in public and to be a public citizen in a way that almost nothing else in our society, as currently constituted under capitalism, supports.
Beautiful.
That's what I like.
Beautiful. The finger pointing at the moon.
So, yeah, I'm going to be thinking about finger pointing at the moon for possibly the rest of ever. But also, you've heard of going to the bar with your friends on your 21st birthday because you can legally drink. Now get ready for going to the library on your 18th birthday because you're old enough for adult programming.
Yeah.
This is something that I personally love very deeply about libraries as a kid who read very high, above my grade level, is that you actually won't find a lot of age restriction here. There's no age restriction on movies, books, any kind of material checkout. That is not how the game goes. We do put age rules on programming for developmental reasons in youth. What's developmentally appropriate for a 5-year-old is not the same as a 12-year-old and things like that. But once you hit sweet 18 years old, you get those wonderful intergenerational opportunities that is so exciting.
Oh, yeah.
And
I remember seeing it at when Film Club did Chinatown, and that allowed for a 24-year-old to talk to a 64-year-old about a 50-year-old movie.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And then you just become friends.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I have friends who are 40 years older than me. They're not pseudo family members. They're just friends.
Yeah.
And this is a great place to foster those kinds of relationships. We have the best job, y'all.
Okay. So programming, amazing. We also like to ask about things that we circulate, because this is, you can get more than just books with your library card, as everyone knows. And we just like to ask people who come to this podcast, do you have a particularly favorite, interesting, weird, cool thing that our library happens to circulate?
When I was an adult services librarian, one of my collections was board games. And our board games are so much more than what the word board game says. First of all, they don't all have boards.
Sure.
A lot of them are card games or they have other elements to them. And we have party games that are meant for like a dozen people. We have games that play really well as an individual by themselves. We have games that play really well for like different ages. We have games where it's like kind of useful to have shared cultural experiences when you play them. So there's a couple of games I just wanted to like shout out because they do specific things. So one of the games that I really love is Hues and Cues. And the reason why I love this is because every time I play it, and I've played it probably a dozen times now, and with different people in my life, you discover that how the people sitting across from you see color and how they perceive how things are named is different than how you do. So it becomes sort of a psychological experiment, a linguistic comparison over the course of just what it feels like a really fun and silly game. So when you play Hues and Cues, you are allowed to give 1 word or 2 word, depending on which round it is, hints for which very specific shade you chose. So it's a shade of mauve. You can't use mauve. You can't use any other colors, but you can use 1 or 2 other words. And everybody tries to figure out exactly where on this gigantic color grid this falls. And you'll discover that what you think is mauve, nobody else thinks is mauve. So I don't know, like the psychological dissonance this game creates is like really informative. And sometimes it's argumentative and other times it's just really creative and weird.
I feel like that's the kind of thing that's ended empires. I can't wait to play this game.
It's super fun. We have games that like engender creativity in their very existence. We have a game that is paint chips, 400 paint chips with their actual names on it. And it's paint chip poetry. So without looking at the words on the paint chips, you just pull colors that you like. And then there's a prompt. And then you use the names of the paint chips to make a poem. And so it can be really interesting to be like, okay, I'm going to stay in a very narrow spectrum of colors. I'm just going to pull all light blue shades and discover like, oh, when light blue shades get named, there's something going on about sky and birds. Or, to create an entire spectrum with like intentional variances. I'm going to choose like opposites on the color wheel, greens and oranges, and make them fight. And what do the naming conventions say about that? So like that can be really great to just like trigger parts of your brain that don't get used that much. And the last one I wanted to shout out is like surreal games, like games that just have a high concept that's incredibly silly. And we have one, it's called Abduction. That's duck, D-U-C-K. Okay, so this is a super fast game. Each round is only 15 minutes, and you are an intern on a UFO working for an alien corporation whose only goal in life is to collect Earth's ducks, but they can only collect those ducks if they're arranged in very specific collections. So you have to use your spatial reasoning and your capacity to think several moves ahead to arrange the ducks in specific ways before your opponents can, without them stealing your ducks so that your ducks get abducted first. It's very surreal. It's very goofy. It also like does that thing again where you get to scratch the part of your brain that maybe your day-to-day life doesn't let you.
That is possibly the best thing I've ever heard. And listener, what you need to know about me is I am a noted board game hater. I sat through many a round of, and again, board games in a broad sense, because many of them were card games in my youth. I sat through many a round of gin, rummy, and euchre that bored me to tears.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm glad you made your own pun.
Oh.
Keep going.
Don't do that to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're such a bad influence. But every single time that I play a game recommended by one of my board game obsessed coworkers, of whom I have several, I have the time of my life. So if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't even like board games, come into the Ferndale Library and say, I'm not really a board game person. Please recommend a game that you recommend to people who don't like board games, because I want to play everything you mentioned. And you can get the technical term for when we recommend books to people is called reader's advisory. You can get advisory for anything at this library: movie advisory, game advisory, puzzle advisory, music advisory, out our ears. Absolutely. And that's,
what's also notable is that over the last 4 minutes, listeners probably heard Mary, Graham, and I actually reacting, because again, you might think that everyone who works in the library knows every single little thing that we circulate.
We don't.
Mary, Graham, and I were discovering in real time.
Never heard of any
all
of
the
these
wonderful
games.
things we have at this library.
Yeah, and it's another thing that I personally love
so
about
many things.
This library in particular is that the people who are in charge of the things are really into the things they are in charge of.
Collection developers.
And the collection developers, yeah. And there's just, and even some of us, like, I'm really into romance. I do not collect any of the romance stuff because I don't work in adult services. But then there are also things that we know completely nothing about, so we turn to our coworkers. It's a little bit, I presume, like having, a medical specialty. So we turn to our coworkers and we say, hey, I want to get into this kind of book, or I am seeing my family this weekend and I want to take a game we're all going to like. And we get to have the same experience that patrons get of, oh, I just picked a book off the shelf on a whim and it changed my life. That has happened to me since working here. Like, we are not immune to the magic of it all either.
No,
which
exactly.
is part of the reason why I wouldn't want to be doing anything else with my career. And thank you so much, Drew, for so much.
But can I shout out one more collection?
Please.
Because it's really making my life better right now.
Yeah.
Which is the Seed Library. So it's late February. Life is terrible. That's just how it is here.
Late February shouldn't exist.
It's really hard.
However,
we have a seed library, and we are at the point of the year when we are processing a lot of seeds into our seed libraries, both vegetables and flowers. And the librarians who work on the seed library, they are gardeners. They understand what works and doesn't work. They're very thoughtful. It's not just the most obvious species that end up in it. And you can browse it and start thinking about, oh, this would be so beautiful by my door. Oh, this would add color where I need it. Oh, yeah. Fresh green beans are infinitely better than the ones from Peru. Like, you can have this moment of, like, there is hope. It is coming.
Yeah.
And on next Sunday, the 23rd, we have programming with the Ferndale Guardian Club that is like the spring, what do we call it? Spring fling. I don't know.
Think spring.
It includes a seed swap element. So if you come, you will meet some amazing local gardeners who have preserved seeds from some of their most successful plants and who are really excited to tell you what these plants are, why they did well, and you can leave with like a completely different set of seeds than you walked in with and a completely different sense of what your garden can be. Spring and summer is coming. It will be okay.
I love it.
The Ferndale gardening scene is insanely cool.
Oh,
One
yeah.
of my, as the collection developer for children's nonfiction, one of the biggest sections that I make sure that we have very well filled out is our gardening, because people around here garden and their kid, what is better than plunging your tiny little hands into the dirt to help out? And so we've got all sorts of books for the whole family, and seeds to go with them. Come on down to your local library. I'm going to have to check out what's in the seed library now. Again, not immune to the magic.
Sure. You know what else is like a garden? A library. Mary Graham.
Yeah.
Oh, Drew, thank you for joining us
I
on the
was about
podcast.
to say, yes, thank you so much, Drew. And thank you, dear listener, for listening to another episode of A Little Too Quiet, the Ferndale Library podcast, which is brought to you by the Friends of the Ferndale Library. We also thank John Duffy for giving us music to open and close each episode. If you want to find more information about supporting this podcast or joining the Friends of the Ferndale Library, a thing I think you should all do, please visit ferndalefriends.org. Please also remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Say it with me. And if you leave us a positive review, we can find even more listeners and spread even more good news about the magic of the libraries.
Yeah.
We will be back next week with more. Thanks again for listening.